You've been to a funeral, maybe recently, maybe a long time ago. You remember the flowers, the specific smell of the room, people standing around, not quite knowing what to do with their hands. Someone said something about peace, or a better place, or how they'd want us to celebrate rather than be sad. There was probably food afterward, because there's always food afterward, as if the right sandwich could somehow bridge the gap between whatever just happened and normal life resuming. The whole thing followed a script you didn't write and didn't choose, but somehow knew by heart. Now here's the question almost nobody stops to ask. Where did that script come from? Not the specific rituals of your culture or religion, the deeper thing underneath all of it. The fact that humans, everywhere on Earth, in every culture that has ever existed, do something when someone dies. Not nothing, something. And the question of what ancient humans did, tens of thousands of years before priests or coffins or flowers or food, before any of the structures we'd recognize, turns out to be one of the most revealing things we know about what kind of creature we actually are. Let's go back, way back, to before any of the rituals we'd recognize existed. The first thing to understand is that for a very long time, we assumed ancient humans didn't really do much when someone died. The assumption was practical. Survival was hard. Resources were scarce. A dead body was a liability, a thing that attracted predators and spread disease. The working theory for most of the 20th century was that early humans probably just moved on, left the body, kept walking. And then archaeologists started digging more carefully, and what they found changed everything. In 1960, in a cave called Shanidar in what is now Iraq, a paleoanthropologist named Ralph Selecki uncovered the remains of a Neanderthal who had died approximately 60,000 years ago. What made this find extraordinary wasn't the bones, it was what was found around the bones. Pollen. Enormous concentrations of pollen from at least 8 different species of flowering plants, clustered so densely around the burial site that researchers concluded the only explanation was that someone had intentionally placed flowers on or around the body. Wildflowers. 60,000 years ago. Before modern humans had even fully spread across the planet, before agriculture, before any civilization anyone had ever heard of, someone gathered flowers and put them next to the person they had lost. Now, the interpretation has been debated since. Some researchers argue the pollen could have arrived via burrowing rodents who stored plant material nearby. But the overall pattern at Shanidar, combined with what was found at dozens of subsequent sites, pointed to something that couldn't be explained away. Neanderthals buried their dead, intentionally, with care. But here's what genuinely surprises people when they go deeper into this. The burial itself was only part of it. What early humans did in the days and hours immediately after someone died looks, when you examine the evidence carefully, remarkably like what we still do today. Researchers who study modern hunter-gatherer societies have documented something consistent across groups with no contact with each other. When a community member dies, the group stops. Not briefly, for an extended period. The Hadza of Tanzania, one of the oldest hunter-gatherer lineages on Earth, traditionally stop all group activities for a period after a death. No hunting, no foraging, no movement. Everyone stays. Everyone is present. This isn't sentimentality operating against survival instinct. Researchers believe it's the opposite. Staying together, processing grief collectively, maintaining the social bonds that had just been reminded of their fragility was itself a survival strategy. A group that scattered after a death was a weaker group. Grieving together was how you held together. And what did they do while they stayed? This is where it gets genuinely fascinating. The evidence from multiple sources suggests that ancient humans talked. Specifically, they talked about the dead person. Stories, memories, repeated tellings of things the person had done, said, survived, or caused. Anthropologist Barbara King, who spent decades studying grief in both animals and humans, argues that this narrative repetition was the original form of what we'd now call eulogy. Not a formal speech, just people, sitting together, saying the same things about someone over and over because saying them out loud made the person temporarily present again. It made the absence feel less total. And here's the thing that makes this more than just a comfort mechanism. Those stories, repeated enough times, became memory, became history. In a world with no writing, no recording, no external storage of any kind, the only way a person survived their own death was in the mouths of the people who had known them. Telling stories about the dead wasn't just grief, it was the oldest form of preservation humans ever invented. But here's something worth pausing on, because it reframes the whole picture. Humans are not the only species that responds to death this way. Elephants, when a member of their group dies, will return to the bones repeatedly, sometimes for years, touching them with their trunks, standing quietly near them in ways that have no functional explanation. Chimpanzees have been documented carrying deceased infants for days or weeks after death, grooming them, protecting them from scavengers, refusing to set them down. Crows hold what researchers have started calling funeral gatherings, where large numbers of birds congregate silently around a dead crow before dispersing. Orcas have been observed pushing the bodies of deceased calves to the surface and holding them there for extended periods. None of these behaviors have an obvious survival benefit. All of them appear to be responses to absence, to the presence of something that was recently alive and now isn't. Barbara King's conclusion, after 2 decades of documenting these behaviors, is that grief is not a human invention, it's a mammalian one, and possibly older than that. Which means that when ancient humans stopped and gathered and stayed near their dead, they weren't doing something uniquely cultural, they were doing something biological, something written into social animals long before the species had a name. Now here's the complication, because not all ancient death practices look gentle or familiar from a modern perspective. Some of what the archaeological record shows is genuinely strange, and it's worth sitting with honestly rather than skipping over. At several Neolithic sites across Europe and Asia, there is evidence of what researchers now call secondary burial. A person would be buried, then sometime later, months or years, dug up. The bones would be cleaned, sometimes painted with red ochre, sometimes arranged deliberately and then reburied, sometimes in a completely different location. In some cases, skulls were separated from the rest of the body and placed with other skulls in what appears to have been a collective ancestor space. The meaning of this isn't entirely clear, but one interpretation, supported by evidence from modern groups that practice similar traditions, is that it represented a 2-stage understanding of death. The first burial was for the body. The second was for what remained after the body was gone, a recognition that the transition from living to dead wasn't instantaneous, but took time, and that the community's obligations to the person didn't end when the body did. In some ancient cultures, this connection to the dead went even further. At Çatalhöyük, a remarkably well-preserved Neolithic settlement in what is now Turkey, dating to around 7,500 BCE, archaeologists found something that stopped them cold. The dead were buried under the floors of the houses, not in a cemetery, not in a separate sacred space, but directly beneath the living areas where families cooked, slept, and raised children. Generation after generation, in the same home, with the dead literally underneath. This wasn't considered disturbing by the people who lived there. Based on the evidence, it appears to have been the opposite. The dead were kept close, intentionally, as if maintaining physical proximity to the people you had lost was not morbid but comforting, as if the boundary between the living and the dead was one the community preferred to keep permeable. Let's be honest about something, because it would be misleading to paint all of this as purely tender or meaningful. Ancient death practices were also shaped by fear and by very practical problems. A body in a warm climate decomposed fast. The smell was powerful. Scavengers were attracted. Disease was a genuine risk. Many of the burial practices that look spiritual from a distance were also solving hard logistical problems. Covering a body with dirt, stone, or ash kept predators away and reduced disease transmission. The red ochre painted onto bones at dozens of ancient sites may have carried spiritual significance, but ochre also has documented antibacterial properties. Meaning and practicality were rarely fully separate. The practices that survived were almost always the ones that managed to be both at once. Stretch this across different cultures, and what emerges is a pattern that repeats on every inhabited continent, independently, without any shared origin. The Chinchorro people of what is now coastal Chile were mummifying their dead as far back as 7000 BCE, more than 2,000 years before the Egyptians developed the practice. In ancient China, Bronze Age burial sites from the Shang dynasty contain extraordinary quantities of grave goods, food, weapons, ritual objects, all placed with the dead on the apparent assumption that the person would need these things, that wherever they were going resembled somewhere enough that supplies were useful. The Scythians of the Central Asian steppe buried their chieftains with horses, servants, food, gold, and weapons, then built enormous earthen mounds over the graves that could be seen for miles across the flat landscape. A death announced across the geography, a grave you couldn't miss. None of these cultures communicated with each other. None of them inherited this from a shared ancestor who had figured it out. Each one arrived at essentially the same conclusion independently, that the dead deserve attention, that the transition deserves marking, that the people left behind need something to do with the enormity of what just happened. And that something, across all of them, involves gathering, ritual, objects, and most consistently, story. Which brings us back to where we started. You've been to a funeral. You know the flowers and the food and the standing around not knowing what to do with your hands. And now you know that none of that is accidental. None of it was invented by the civilization you happened to be born into. All of it is sitting on top of something so old it predates language as we recognize it. The instinct to stop, to stay, to speak about the person, to mark the moment, to not let a life end without acknowledgement. That's not a cultural tradition. That's something much older. And the next time you find yourself at a gathering after a loss, saying the same stories about the same person alongside people who loved them, you're not just being polite. You're doing the oldest thing humans do. You always were.